What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, and it's time for your favorite series. It is the top Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. As always, I'm going to bring you a great variety of Pokemon card auctions that occurred this week. We saw already graded cards from the Scarlet and Violet 151 English set come by. I'll be on certain CGC graded card sales as well. And we also saw some amazing full art EX cards from the black and white era that we never see, and they hit some very impressive prices, so stay tuned for all that and more. Today's amazing auction recap is brought to you by the great people over at KantoShark.com. Right now, KantoShark.com is having an amazing weekend sale filled with Zards, Stoizes, and Carps up for grabs with newly lowered prices. Not only that, but for the first 12 orders that come through, they'll be throwing in 3 free Obsidian Flames booster packs with your purchase. So when you're done watching this auction recap, go buy something at KantoShark.com while they're having the sale. And as always, let me know what you pick up. Alright folks, it's my favorite time of the week, the auction recap. Let's jump into this video. Starting off with Modern, of course, we had a few of the graded cards from the newest Pokemon 151 set. Now, these aren't a whole bunch of cards. I will be doing a more comprehensive review of these graded cards in an upcoming top 10 video. But here we have a PSA 9 Special Illustration Rare Alakazam EX that sold for about $100 this week. We also saw this Venusaur EX got a PSA 8 and sold for also about $100. And then we saw this Charizard EX Special Illustration Rare. They got the PSA 9 and sold for $202.50. And don't you worry, folks, we have a few of these cards in PSA 10 coming down the pike. I will be reporting on those prices here very shortly. Continuing with some modern cards, here is a Quaquaval EX, Special Illustration Rare, hitting some monster numbers, selling as a PSA 10 for $31 this week. Yes, Quaquaval to the moon. We also saw a stronger card from Paldea Evolved in this full art Iono trainer in PSA 10 that sold for $220. Here we have a special delivery Bidoof, still going strong with its value, selling as a PSA 10 this week for $715. A couple of interesting Japanese promo sales. Here is a limited Master Battle Set Alola Friends cards in CGC 10 Gem Mint condition that sold for $2,550. Here we have a PSA 10 Mimikyu Scream promo that came by this week. It sold for $4,500. We also saw this 2016 XY Japanese promo. It is a Mega Tokyo's Pikachu in PSA 10 that sold for $4,950. And we also saw this 2006 Japanese XY promo of the Charizard EX, autographed by Hitoshi. Both the autograph and the card graded a PSA 10 and sold for an even $5,000. Up next, we have some ugly business concerning the Moonbreon VMAX. Lately, folks, this card has been selling for around $770 as a PSA 10, while back in July and August, it was selling pretty consistently for over $1,100. So a bit of a decline in the value of this card, which is to be expected as there are a bazillion PSA 10 examples that now exist, so it's inevitable that the value is going to go down a little bit for a card like this. Up next was that lineup of the black and white full art EX cards I was telling you about. Here they are from Boundaries Crossed. We saw this full art Caldeo EX sold for $560. Here's a full art Ho-Oh EX from Dragons Exalted that sold for $960. Here we have a full art Latios EX from Plasma Freeze that sold for $825. And then we saw this full art Zekrom EX from Next Destinies that sold for $3,050, along with this full art Reshiram, also from Next Destinies, that sold for $3,450. Those are pretty impressive numbers, folks. What do you think? Up next, we have this 2021 Pokemon Stamp Box Charizard. That sold as a PSA 10 for $7,100. According to the title, and I'm not sure if this is true, but it states that they are no longer grading this kind of card at PSA, or this stamp, or whatever it is, so yeah, pretty big numbers there, folks. Up next, we have our vintage lineup on eBay. We have a CGC 10 Gem Mint Glurak first edition from base set. This is the German Charizard that sold for $3,600. From Jungle set, we saw a CGC 10 Gem Mint first edition Kangaskhan that sold for $560. And then from Fossil, we saw a CGC 10 first edition Lapras that sold for $455. And both the Lapras and the Kangaskhan are absolute monster cards to get in a PSA 10. Here from Team Rocket, we saw a first edition Dark Charizard Holo. Also got a CGC 10 and sold for $1,526. From Gym Heroes, we have a very expensive trainer in this holographic Brock. Easily the most expensive trainer from the Gym series in PSA 10, sold for $2,025. From Gym Challenge, we saw this first edition Blaine's Charizard that sold for $2,800. And then we saw a CGC 10 pristine example of this card sell for $3,050. So only $250 more for this card than the Gem Mint copy. Something's not stirring the Kool-Aid there, if you ask me. Up next, we have a PSA 10 first edition Lieutenant Surge's Fearow that sold for $1,025, along with this Rocket Scyther that sold for $1,325. And then we saw a PSA 10 first edition Blaine's Moltres that sold for $3,050. Definitely between this and the Sabrina's Gengar from the set being the most valuable cards as PSA 10s. Speaking of Sabrina's Gengar, here's a CGC 10 example that sold for $1,585. We also saw this CGC 10 Giovanni's Persian that sold for a very pitiful price of $455. And I say pitiful because a PSA 10 copy of this card sold not that long ago for $3,700. So, yeah, quite a price difference there for that card. Speaking of crazy prices, here is a CGC 10 Gem Mint First Edition Slowking. Sold this week for $760. And I've been kind of harping on this card for the past few weeks because it wasn't that long ago this card was selling for $1,775, $1,825. Just a week or two ago, it sold for $2,250. So it went from that much all the way down to $760 for a CGC 10 copy. What have we learned? And then in a similar fashion, we saw this first edition Pichu from Neo Genesis got the CGC 10 Gem Mint grade, sold this week for $1,680. And may I remind you that a week or so ago, this card sold for $3,750. So what is that? Cut in half? A little bit more? Yeah. Are we learning yet? Let me know. Here we saw a first edition Espeon from Neo Discovery in CGC 10 that sold for $1,025, while the PSA 10 example sold for $2,600. Here we have a Politoed first edition Holo from Neo Discovery that sold for $1,025, and a PSA 10 first edition Tyranitar that also sold for $1,626. A couple of cards from Neo Revelation. Here's a first edition Ho-Oh. Got the CGC 10 and sold for $1,180. And then we saw the first edition Entei, also CGC 10, sold for $1,714 this week. We saw a CGC 10 Dark Gengar from Neo Destiny that sold for $820. And then we saw a first edition CGC 10 Shining Magikarp that sold for $1,525. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Shining Celebi first edition that sold for $1,125. And then we saw a few more Shining cards. Here's a first edition Shining Tyranitar in CGC 10, sold for $1,851. A PSA 10 first edition Shining Raichu that sold for $2,077. And then we saw a first edition Shining Mewtwo in CGC 10 that sold for $1,625. And then we saw this card yet again sell for $1,625. That seems to be the CGC 10 price for this card this past week. Here we have a CGC 10 first edition Shining Charizard, sold for $5,100, while the PSA 10 copy sold this week for $8,500. And then I saw a few PSA 10 reverse holo cards from Legendary Collection come by. This one here was the one that sold for the most. It's the Flareon reverse holo, sold for $1,009 this week. A Couple cards from the E Series. Here's a Holo Tyranitar from Expedition in PSA 10 that sold for $1,275, while the Holo Tyranitar from Aquapolis sold as a PSA 10 for $1,600. Here we have a Crystal Lugia from Aquapolis in PSA 10 that sold for $8,650 this week. And then from Fire Red Leaf Green, we saw this Gengar EX in PSA 10 that sold for $2,300. And last but certainly not least, for our graded cards on eBay, we have a PSA 8 Tropical Mega Battle promo card that sold for $14,188.88. A couple of very interesting sealed booster box sales from none other than TCA Gaming. Here we have a sealed Diamond and Pearl Majestic Dawn booster box. And if you don't know, you can pull beauties from this box, such as the Level X Glaceon and Leafeon cards. This box sold this week for $5,900. And then we saw this EX Hidden Legends box that sold for $7,500. We saw an EX Power Keepers booster box sell for $12,700. And then an Unlimited Neo Destiny booster box that sold for $18,866. And then last but not least, we have an EX Holon Phantoms booster box. And that box art is just next level right there. That's how it's done, folks. And if you don't know, you can pull cards such as Gold Star Mewtwo, Gold Star Pikachu from this box. It sold for $22,000 this week. Up next was the PWCC weekly auction block lineup. Let's go over a few of the very notable sales. We have a Blastoise EX from Fire Red Leaf Green that sold for $1,380. From EX Team Rocket Returns, we have a Rockets Suicune EX that sold for $1,710. And then from the same set, we also saw this Rockets Snorlax EX in PSA 10 that sold for $2,310. We saw a Black Label Umbreon GX from Hidden Fates, and it sold for $1,860 this week. We saw this 2011 Japanese World's Championship Tropical Beach promo card in PSA 9 that sold for $1,860. And then we also saw this Japanese promo Daisuke Club Pikachu in BGS 9.5 condition, sold for $2,190. Up next, from 1996, we have this BGS 9.5 Misty Phone card here that sold for $2,520. And then from Sun and Moon Dream League, we saw this Black Label Clefairy come by that sold for an even $3,000. From Team Magma versus Team Aqua, we saw this Suicune EX that sold for $3,120. And then we saw this PSA 9 Gold Star Torchic from EX Team Rocket Returns, and it sold for an even $3K. Here we saw another Moonbreon come by, but this one was a BGS 10 Black Label, selling this week for $3,360. And then, of course, we saw the OG Moonbreon from Neo Discovery, and it sold as a PSA 10 for an even $6,000. And let's not forget this first edition Shining Mewtwo from Neo Destiny that sold for 4,320 big ones. A couple of Charizards came by. Here's a BGS 9.5 first edition French base set Charizard that sold for $6,300 this week. And then we saw the Japanese Charizard from Black and White Plasma Gale that sold for $4,800 as a PSA 10. And then we saw this 2015 World's Championship Festival promo card in PSA 8 condition, sold for $10,500. And the auction of the week I'm going to have to give to this Corporate History deck, which contains all those very valuable cards that we see come by week after week. This sold for a grand total of $97,600. That concludes the auction recap, folks. Thank you so much. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today. I will catch you all in my next one.